Morena, good morning, Aotearoa. How are you this morning? It's absolutely lovely to be here, be back with you guys live for our kōrero this morning. I'm really, really excited about just the depth of what we're going to talk about today. I think tag your teammates, because this is one that you don't want to miss. Just quickly before we carry on, I just got off a phone call with Kimberly and Penny, and we've just been discussing some options for next week. We know that we are all going back to work next Wednesday, and some of us will be working from home, and some of us will be working with the children, and we want to be of service, and we recognize that there's an opportunity for us to really engage in some deep, connected, professional learning together. So we're floating the idea of potentially doing a virtual conference to connect and combine our communities and have some of our wonderful, inspiring speakers really deliver just the content that speaks to our hearts. So we want to kind of just throw that out there. If you guys can give us some feedback, whether that would be something of value for us. It's going to take a little bit to organize, but I know that the end product is going to be pretty spectacular. And for those who are going to work, what we'll do is we'll record those sessions so you can watch it kind of later on that day or that night or over the weekend or something like that, so that everyone gets to be a part of this. So please let us know. If we get a good response for it, I'm happy to put the work in and try and pull something together. So this morning, we have Vince with us, and I'm going to just invite him into our broadcast.
Hello.
Good morning, my friend.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon. That's it, Vince. It's such a delight to have you on the podcast or the live broadcast. We have I've read some of your work, and that's what really captured me. I think the work that I read was around letting children remain in flow state through playing together, and the language that you use conveys such a deep understanding of healing and the flowing of energy from life that I was just blown away, and I had to kind of know more. And so I just couldn't stop reading all the incredible blog posts that you wrote. So I'm really thankful that you're taking this time to talk to us. I know that it's going to be super interesting, and the topics we're going to cover is going to be wide and deep at the same time. So welcome, my friend.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I didn't tell you, actually, that I was raised by about 5 nannies from Christchurch as a kid.
Really?
Yeah, my parents worked full time, so they needed a nanny, and we had, like, I think it was 5 of them. They all came from Christchurch, so they'd all stay for about a year. So I grew up with a bit of a Kiwi influence. Yeah, it's kind of nice to go back in time a little bit.
I always say to my Canadian friends, I really haven't met a Canadian person that I don't like. So you're coming at the end of the streak. Hopefully that's true still after this conversation. But yeah. The Canadians, they just seem to really resonate with us Kiwis and the New Zealanders. We have a very similar, I think, attitude to life.
Yeah, I think you're in the shadow of Australia, and we're in the shadow of the United States, so we kind of have that in common.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
What has isolation been like for you guys? How has Canada responded to the crisis and the virus, and what's the temperature there?
I think we've done a good job at following orders, and we haven't got it as bad as the United States on a per capita level, and we closed our borders, I think, quick enough, so we haven't had it too bad. I mean, it's definitely bad, but it's it's a spread out country, so we're naturally quarantined by the way cities are far apart from each other. But right. Yeah, and I live in Vancouver, which is the 3rd largest city in Canada, and I actually really love the fact that it's like a small town right now in a big city. So I kind of have the best of both worlds. So I can drive wherever I need to pretty quickly, and the streets are quiet. I hear the birds a lot more. So it's kind of the mixture of small and large city together at once. So I like it.
Wonderful. I'm
Yeah.
going to start with a quote, and you've written 2 beautiful articles and blog posts on a response to the COVID crisis, this moment that we find ourselves where the earth is breathing and we have been interrupted in every chase that we've had. And you quote Marianne Williamson, you said that wrote this, and I think it's so poignant. Something very beautiful happens to people when their world has fallen apart. A humility, a nobility, a higher intelligence emerges at just the point when our knees hit the floor. Perhaps in a way, that's where humanity is now, about to discover we're not as smart as what we thought we were. We'll be forced by life to surrender our attacks and defenses, which avail us nothing, and finally break through into the collective beauty of who we really are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
On the back of that, help us kind of make some sense from your perspective of what is happening and what is the global opportunity in this moment.
Well, humility is not that easy, and I don't think it's easy for the Western world, for the European influenced Western world, and because we love our progress, we love our ideas of success, and this certainly can tie into education in the sense that we impose those ideas on how we educate. So we don't do well at slowing down, and again that ties into children as well, and the fact that how rapidly we overstructure them and how quickly we want them to learn and grow. So there, in a way, there's a humbling process right now where we have to really stop and consider how things came to be to this place. That to me is the key question. How did it come to be? And I feel that's an important question we all need to be sitting with right now, is how did we get to this point? And who are we when we're not our job? Who are we when we're not an educator? What's left of me when so many things are stripped away? Well, my personal experience of being humbled, and I have been humbled pretty hard in my life, is, what's left of me is my spirit. And I think that's the great reclamation opportunity in these times, is that when we are forced to slow down and empty, we have to still enough to connect to something that we may not pay attention too much to in our busyness, and in not paying attention to it, there's great consequences on how we live, how we educate, how we raise our children, our overall health, and the health of the planet.
You've noted on I know on your Facebook as well that you've just been stumbling upon these threads where parents are somewhat surprised and open to the idea that their children are happier, they're more alive than ever during this break. There's differences happening. What do you make of that kind of idea?
I think children thrive more in simple environments. I think they do better when things are slow and simple. I remember a story this mother gave to me in one of my events, and she said, she had a big birthday party and arranged for her 4-year-old, and all the people came over, and there was bells and whistles and streamers and birthday party plates and balloons and gifts galore. And then when it came time to opening all the gifts, they couldn't find the 4-year-old. So they're all looking for the 4-year-old, and he was upstairs in a room in the corner in a box, just an empty box. And he was very happy in his box. So we've forgotten how to enjoy just the box. And we keep ourselves busy, and that creates a great deal of anxiety. And the truth is, the busyness creates anxiety, and the anxiety creates busyness. They're their own loop, which I can get into later on. So what I'm sensing is that when kids have less, they have more. They are not as pressured. And the thing is when there's less, they actually can listen to themselves more. There's more opportunity for them to be self-directed, because they're not being told what to do throughout the day. They have more time and space to listen to what their heart's telling them to do. And in that, there's more room for imagination and creativity. And that's one of the things I'm seeing is right now, it's not that just that kids are happier, but they're more creative as well. Now, I also want to acknowledge that a lot of kids have it harder right now because for a lot of kids, home is less safe than school. So I want to recognize that. But there's a huge number of parents who are, as you said, questioning the school system because they're seeing their kids genuinely happier right now, less pressured. And this I can go into more once we start talking about the education system.
You mentioned something that just stood out for me. You said because it's simple and unhurried, children are able to listen to themselves more.
Yeah.
And how disconnected we find ourselves often as adults from our own heart and our own body. And I can just see it as we rush our children to school, drop them off, or to our early childhood centers, and then rush them from here. And they are being herded in some sense from one place to the other and instructed with what to do and not given the space to just simply be. Seems that you talk about one of the problems is that we've normalized dysfunction, right?
Yeah. We've
So
normalized dysfunction. So the question is, why do we rush children around? I tend to not like to talk about symptoms too much. I like to get to the core. And for me, in my opinion, in my experience of both as a healing practitioner and as a speaker, it is my personal opinion that children historically have not gotten their needs met. And I'm talking about their emotional needs, certainly not their physical needs as well in many cases, but not their emotional needs met. And what happens is the way that we cope with that is we stuff down our feelings and we get busy. We get busy to distract ourselves. And we forget that why we're even busy in the first place. So distraction and speed are two very pervasive means of coping. And yet people don't draw the link between that and their childhood emotional trauma because of the extent that how, as a society, we've normalized what happened to us as a kid. Oh, it's just fine that I was spanked. And yet spanking has the same effect on the brain as what we would call physical abuse. So, so we've normalized this. We normalized it as children growing up, and we normalized it as adults. And so because we've normalized it and we've disassociated from our childhood wounding, we actually don't draw the link between that and why we're going 100 miles an hour. So then what happens is that the parent or the teacher then pushes their child at a similar speed. They get them involved in all these activities. They rush and they ready them for schooling and through schooling. They have high expectations on how they should learn and how quickly they should learn. And they wonder why their little Johnny isn't getting higher grades and performing at a higher level. And what happens is in this speed mentality, there's more of an emphasis on the future. When, what school, what college is he or she going to get into? So now we're raising children to be little adults. It's all very much linked to our own coping mechanism. There's a saying that a parent tells a child to put on a coat so the parent feels warm. So when we are moving kids fast, when we are expecting them to act like little adults, the question to ask is, who are we doing this for? Is it for the child or is it for me? Because it's what I need for myself to feel better, and it's what I've needed for 40 years. So, see, it's if we don't see things more clearly for how they are, what we're going to do is we're going to try to fix the school system, which we're doing, to make it more self-directed, to make it more play-based. But the problem is the undercurrent of trauma still has yet to be addressed. including the underlying trauma that underpins and gives rise to the school system itself, which has its roots in residential schooling, colonialism, Protestant correctional institutions, which we can go on into. So there's my long-winded answer for you.
There's so much to unpack in that, and you mentioned the word trauma several times, and I'll read the Dr. Gabor Mate quote, which you've also quoted in one of your blogs, which I think really summarizes it. And then let's go into this idea, because I think we have some time this morning to talk about these underlying dysfunctions, both in our education system and personally, and how we cope with it.
Yeah.
He says, I think normalcy is a myth. The idea that some people have pathology and the rest of us are normal is crude. There's nothing about any mental ill person, and it doesn't matter what their diagnosis is, that I couldn't recognize in myself. The reality is that in every case, mental illness is an outcome of traumatic events. And so then to separate out these two, those who meet the particular criteria for a particular diagnosis from the rest of us is utterly unscientific and unhelpful.
Mm-hmm.
More to the point, you need to look at what is it about our society that generates what we call abnormality.
Which again, that last sentence there is again the question of how did it come to be?
Right? How did it come to be? Can you talk to us? What's your definition of trauma? Can you give us some understanding of what that is? Because maybe some of us are looking back at our childhood and we go, well, it was relatively free of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe they're going, oh yeah, I definitely experienced some really significant traumas. But from what I understand, there's a broader definition that you work with.
Well, trauma can happen at different levels. On one level, there is the trauma, what we would call, say, developmental trauma that happens to us as a growing child. The trauma is not the event, it's how it impacts the body, and specifically the nervous system. In a way, it's you know, if I get frightened because I look at my father in the eyes and he has a really angry look in his eyes, if I can, there could be a spike in the sympathetic nervous system. There can be spike in the nervous system that's very much about fight and flight, about activation. So there's a spike, it kind of goes up. It's like, oh my God. But what happens is that if I can bring that back down, then I can come back to homeostasis. My body relaxes, it's calm. So for instance, if you see ducks fighting, after the ducks finish their fight, they shake. They release it. But when the situations that we find ourselves in as children become chronic, the nervous system can't regulate, it can't come down. So it gets stuck in that spiked, what we call arousal state. It's hyperarousal. There's also what's called hypoarousal, which is basically the opposite, where we almost become limp. We're becoming like disassociated and limp and really deeply almost flat toned. So the nervous system gets stuck, and that then affects it creates so many health problems. It creates most of our physical problems, as I told you yesterday, are related to unresolved trauma, unresolved survival responses that are stuck in the system. So a healthy nervous system basically goes up into sympathetic arousal and then down into parasympathetic. So activation, deactivation, activation, deactivation. But when it goes up and gets stuck, or goes down and gets stuck, that's kind of the simple definition of trauma. And then it gets stuck in our system, and then it stays stuck, and it's affecting us for decades. And so, decades later, I'm in a relationship with someone and I'm responding to that person, or I'm responding to children from that old dysregulation in my nervous system. It's staying with me. So trauma is known as the eternally present past. So I'm relating to people today as if I'm still at home in the kitchen with my scary father. Right? So that's one level of trauma. Another level of trauma is what we inherit from our ancestors, what's passed down epigenetically. We now know, as research shows, that memories are passed down as far back as 14 generations.
Wow.
So they did an experiment with a female mouse, and what they did is they presented this mouse with the smell of a rose. And after a while of presenting this rose to her, they shocked her simultaneously. So now there was a coupling, as we say, between the scent and the shock. And so if the mouse was then presented with the rose alone thereafter, she would have a physiological reaction, even without the actual shock. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Okay. 5 generations down, they presented a rose to the mouse, and that mouse had the same physiological reaction without the shock. So I don't remember who said it, but and I wish I could, but it was something to the extent of pain stays in family systems until someone is ready to feel it.
Wow, that's massive, and we're going to get to later, and we're talking about sensitive issues really here, and I think a lot of our audience would be listening, going and recognizing and relating. Mm-hmm. And through the broadcast, we want to kind of move towards like, how can we heal our trauma? But I want to just kind of stay on this idea and come at it from different kind of ways as well. I think in Gowmon probably says like trauma is the disconnection from oneself in the present moment. That which you talked about, as we rush children from place to place, they never get to connect to their authentic self. So any moment where we disconnect from ourselves, from our authenticity, essentially creates a small trauma. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. So here's another way of wording it, and Stephen Porges, who wrote the polyvagal theory, said something close to this. He says, with trauma, patterns of connection are replaced with patterns of protection.
Mm-hmm.
So patterns of connection are replaced with patterns of protection. So we have to disconnect to some degree so we can self-preserve.
Right.
So there's 2 ways of disconnecting. There's disconnecting internally and there's disconnecting externally. So it's no longer safe to attach or bond or connect with my primary caregiver. So I need to pull back. That's a disconnect. Simultaneously, the amount of fear and pain in my system, emotional pain, is so overwhelming that I need to disconnect from that. So now I'm disconnecting outwardly and I'm disconnecting inwardly. So now we're becoming wired to have an attachment adaptation, which I won't get into, but basically where it affects our ability to be in a relationship later on in life, because we've learned through our primary attachment figures that we need to disconnect to survive, and that wiring stays in us later on, decades later, when we meet our beloved, or even in the way we relate to friends or children.
So anytime where you were, during childhood or later, where you didn't feel safe in the present moment within the context of relationship, there was an adaptation response purely designed for survival, to keep you safe, right? And that adaptation becomes the wiring that then becomes the pattern later in your life. Am I kind of on the right page?
Just to correct your language, you said every time I felt or someone feels unsafe. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily, because kids can feel unsafe and then have a parent who can be that secure base for them that lets them regulate their nervous system. But without that secure base there, children are not going to be able to properly self-regulate in many ways. And as I said yesterday in our conversation, small infants are not, they don't have the capacity to self-regulate. And for your listeners, self-regulate means self-soothe, self-calm.
Let's talk about that, because I thought that was such an interesting perspective. You kind of have an idea different to some around self-regulation, and even like teaching mindfulness and meditation in schools, and and you talk about co-regulation. Can you give us an understanding of that?
Yeah, I'm pretty passionate about that. So just to bring everyone up to speed. So self-regulation, as I'm sure most, if not all of you know, is the ability to self-calm, self-soothe. Co-regulation, though, is using the relationship to calm. So for instance, co-regulation means very simply that the mother's calm engenders the child's calm. Her calming presence helps the child to feel calm. So teachers know that when they walk into a classroom, and if they got anger coming out of their nostrils, the kids are going to feel that anger. It's going to affect the space. But if the teacher has rainbows coming out of their ears, well, the children are going to feel that. Their energy, the teacher's energy, affects the whole space. So if the teacher walks into the room with a regulated nervous system, she's calm, she's present, that has ripple effects. So she's literally regulating the space through her own presence. Infants, when they're born, don't have the capacity to self-soothe. And the reason is because the part of the brain responsible for self-regulation, which is called the orbitoprefrontal cortex, right there, is not developed yet. Children have limited capacity to self-soothe. They can suck their thumb, they can move a little bit, but generally they don't have the capacity. So what is required? What is required is a safe, secure bond or attachment with an adult, ideally the parents. And in that safe relationship, it's that bond, that we energy, that allows for that part of the brain, the orbitoprefrontal cortex, to develop. That's what develops the brain. And therefore, it's through that connection, that bond, that the child eventually builds the neurobiology to be able to self-regulate. So what do we have now? We have schools that are becoming trauma-informed. And in that trauma-informed awareness, they are coming up with ways to help kids self-regulate in the classroom or outside of the classroom, in the gymnasium, for instance. And so there's all these techniques. One may be to give them a yoga ball to sit on at their desk. Another one is there's desks that have pedals, so they pedal while they are at their desks, or they have a weighted mat that they put on their legs, which is used often in a therapy. A weighted blanket is used often in a therapy session by the therapist and the client. So I get it, that weightedness helps to create regulation. I've heard of some classes having a treadmill in the classroom. There's chewing gum, there's squishing toys, and there's obviously the movement towards teaching kids mindfulness and meditation as well. All wonderful intentions behind that, but here's my issue. Here's my beef. Is that the fundamental problem is that children didn't get their needs met in the context of relationship, because the co-regulating or interactive regulating relationship between parent and child was not there in the way it was needed. So we're taking an issue that has its issue we're taking an issue that you have, meaning kids that aren't regulated in school, and solving it in a way that has the kid be isolated, when the roots of the problem is that they didn't have their needs met in a relationship. And so what's needed is a relational solution, not a solution where the child is put in isolation, because the fundamental problem is that the relationship wasn't there in the first place. And here's the other thing. If we are putting kids in a spot on the floor to meditate, or we're giving them a mat, or we're giving them something to deal with it, what we're doing is we're pointing at the child on some level and saying, you're the one with the problem. So what we're doing is we're separating the child from the larger systemic issue, which is a relational issue that the adults are directly a part of. Meaning the adults weren't there for the child. The adults themselves are not regulated in their system. So this is the problem, is that it's completely backwards, in my opinion. I hope that makes sense.
This is so powerful. This is so powerful. What you're saying is, instead of throwing techniques and teaching yoga, which all has good intention, is that the root of what we're talking about here is actually the calm of the caregiver regulating the calm of the child. And instead of focusing all our attention on techniques to calm the children, we would be well served to start looking at our own traumas so that we can heal ourselves in order to heal the child.
So it's a pretty good way that we can avoid doing that. You see, if we point at the child and say, well, you have the mental illness, then I don't have to point at myself and say, where do I need to regulate?
Right.
You see, it's a form of bypassing.
How does play help heal the world in this context? If we're moving onto, well, maybe first of all, talk to us about how you think the educational system has been dysfunctioned, and then let's move that towards understanding the role of play in this.
Well, I generally point to 3 different routes for education. One is residential schooling, which is a result of colonization, obviously. The forced removal of children from their culture, their language, their traditions, away from their family, away from a way of being raised that has far more wisdom than what we have in the colonial dominant mind, right? Where children are the center of the circle, not in a desk that's a right-angled desk, looking at a right-angled chalkboard, being taught right-angled linear information, to a brain that is not even fully developed yet in its left linear mind, which is the logical brain. But that's a whole different topic. So, number 1. Number 2 is the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution, had this big surge of factories. So what did they need? They needed jobs. They needed people to work in the factories. So what did they do? They built schools because they needed people to learn to become workers. So what they did is they designed schools to replicate the factories. So children, and even the bell came from the factory design. So children are put in rows and they learn repetitive information, like very didactic, standardized, heads down, obey, learning procedures, so that then when they go into the repetitive, bland environment of the factory, they're essentially prepared for it. So a child, in a way, is designed through that model to be a cog in the factory model. The school is designed to make them a cog. Now here's the other thing to think about, is creativity is a threat to that system. Research shows that in primary schools, children who are the most creative garner the least amount of favoritism from their teachers.
Wow.
Why? Because creativity is a subversive act of the dominant culture. Because creativity means, A, I'm going to think for myself. B, I'm going to think differently from the norm, from the standard, from the consensus mindset. So, and so in a conveyor belt economy, that is the factory, why would the people who run those factories want imagination? They want obedience and conformity. So we have to prepare kids to fit into that standardized system at the cost of their spirit. Number 3 is Protestant correctional institutions. We're going back in time to Europe. So what did they do then? Well, what they did in those schools is they broke the will of children in horrific ways through all forms of abuse. They were beaten. And what was beaten out of them specifically? Their will was beaten out of them. Because a willful child is a child that will deviate from the straight line of conformity. obedience. A willful child is going to go to hell. So we don't want that child to go to hell. We want that child to go to heaven. So let's beat the child up and get them to obey and fit in. You know, will is wed to the word wild, right? Willful, wild, and a wild child. So we've taught children through abusive, oppressive acts to suppress the wild spirit, their willful spirit, to not be self-directed. So historically, children have been horribly abused, to make it quite simple. Now, this current model of public education has its roots deeply into this. Like, its roots are thick in this. So the problem is, in my opinion, if the school system attempts to change itself, and there is progress certainly in Canada, and I'm guessing there is in New Zealand, where we're making it more play-based, more self-directed, where we're becoming more trauma-informed. That's all wonderful. But in my opinion, if we don't stop, all of us, and specifically parents, teachers, administrators, and government, and sit and say, how did this come to be? And feel the gravity of what children have gone through and grieve it, like weep it, like really weep the history of school and the consequence it has had and continues to have on children today. In my opinion, the school system changes are not going to stick because the roots are still there, you know.
Somewhat putting a plaster on something that is a wound that's been festering for a very long time.
But you see, that's how we cope individually. That's the whole point. So
Right.
if we're going to do it individually, we're going to do it on a systems level.
Mm-hmm.
You see, it's rising above. It's called rising above or overcoming. But overcoming and rising above has nothing to do with healing. It's about surviving. There's a guy named Andrew Feldmar in Vancouver who's a therapist. He says the false self is for surviving, the real self is for living. The false self is for surviving, the real self is for living. So we're very good at surviving. We're amazing survivors.
Mm-hmm.
But the system is an expression of unresolved trauma that we have patched up and risen above. But, you know, healing, there's a saying with healing, the way out is the way through. So if you want out of a complex, pain-ridden system, you have to go down. You have to go in, and you have to sit. We have to get a gathering of people to sit and say, let's look at what our roots are in, and not go into fixing. Not sit here and plan solutions on how to fix, because even fixing is a way to avoid feeling. Let's not think of solutions. Let's just feel the magnitude of what's been and the impact on children, the impact on you. And let's grieve that without coming up with solutions. No solutions for 10 hours straight, just feeling. And then the heart will open, because there's heartbreak. What is heartbreak? Well, heartbreak is an opening in the heart. And in that opening, we might hear an old little voice from a forgotten place that might have whispering wisdom for us that will then point us in a new direction. But unless we go into heartbreak, then we're going to keep, you know, moving the goalposts, so to speak.
So heartbreak is the opening of the heart, and the beginning of healing is to feel it, to heal it.
That's right.
In order, and we get so scared of that because we think, well, that's not productive. that's not coming up with a new policy framework, or that's not adding, and we miss the first step, and we can and so we go to step 2 and 3, and the whole cycle continues. Is that?
The whole cycle continues. Let's go to another policy framework, you said. Well, that's a very, very good way for us to stay above the body. You see, the body is where the body's dangerous. For a young child who's terrified and overwhelmed and hurt, the body becomes dangerous ground. So we have to rise above the body. Where do we go? We go into the mind. We go into the mind. So then the mind becomes obsessed with solutions, fixing, new frameworks, new strategies, new, and then we get to a point where we have a global shutdown. Because what we're doing is we're shutting down the collective mind that thinks it knows what it's doing, but it's actually causing major harm, to still us enough with the hopes that maybe we'll drop down into the old forgotten body that needs our attention, which is where the younger part of us lives. And so what happens, though, is that we have an education system that colludes with this. Because what the education system does is, what is it does? It teaches the mind. It helps the mind become a stronger, more productive, more strategic, more critically thinking mind. So what happens is that the system is designed to collude with the coping mechanism of excessive thinking and strategizing by creating, as the grades go higher, as a system that moves away from play and more to academia. So the system perpetuates that loop, and so do the parents who pressure success within that framework. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? That's important to understand that. So the system is designed, to the degree that we understand how absolutely pervasive this is, it's a wake up. It's a wake up.
100%.
It's a wake up.
How do we individually, and you said the body is where the younger child lives, the younger self lives, and it's that younger self that we've become so disconnected and scared of. Can you elaborate for us a little bit to understand how to even get back in touch with our own younger self, or even our own body, and how the body keeps the score in some sense?
Bessel van der Kolk, excellent book. Well, okay, let's go back. The body becomes a dangerous place. It's not safe to feel. So what healing is about is slowly coming back to your body. Children are very much in their body. They move in twists, turns, spirals. Nothing they do, think, dream up is linear. They're very non-linear. Trauma rigidifies the body. It makes it tense, contracted, constricted. And so what happens is, years later, the only way we're getting on a dance floor is if we have, a case of lager, right? Whereas a 4-year-old will jump on the dance floor and be happy as anything. Or the 4-year-old will walk down the street and spontaneously sing a song. So there's fluidity. There's spontaneity.
Play, right?
There's play, it goes back to there's I can't remember who said, it's Wendy something. She said, children don't plan before they color. They just color, right? So they listen to the instincts of their body and act on it. But what we do is, because we're disconnected from the body, we rely on the mind. And the thinking, planning mind starts to overplan and overthink. And then it doesn't know how to be spontaneous. And it discounts our intuition, our instincts, our body-based source of creativity, our felt sense, which is where creativity comes from. So we've disconnected from our body. So to make it very simple, there's so many different ways to heal, but ultimately we need to learn to feel again in a way that's safe and manageable. Some of us have more trauma in our system than others. And so going into the body can be very terrifying depending on your history. And, so it's terrifying to learn to feel sadness again. It can be overwhelming to feel anger. It can be overwhelming to feel rage, And one of the fears that people have is, if I go in there, that old chamber of grief, I will drown. It'll swallow me up and I'll never get out. That's a common fear. So we need to learn to work with skilled practitioners, to heal, to slowly befriend the body again.
Yeah. The as I'm listening to you, I'm getting a new sense of awe for spaces where children are allowed to, or create a space that's created for children to play and be self-directed and spontaneous. And then to think about myself as an adult and how rigid I've become in many senses. I just the other day, like maybe last week, I had a trigger response at home, whatever reason it was, and I was like, I just need to get out, and I went for a walk in nature, and my daughter came running behind me, and I went. We've got a golf course next door, and I was like, okay, readjust myself, but I felt myself in this moment. I may have had some parent guilt, and I felt myself in this moment with her, trying to make the most of the moment and to almost create the moment. I was like, okay, how am I going to make the most of this moment now? And I felt the pressure, and I felt kind of like you said, rigidity, which is just coming from my own self. But I had this thought of, I wonder if I can learn how to throw with my left hand as well as I throw with my right hand. It was a spontaneous thought. And I just picked up some seed pods and I started throwing it with my left hand. And then I invited my daughter to come and throw with me, and we just started playing. I loved it. I was kind of like fascinated with this idea, like how far can I throw? And then, and my daughter was like maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and she kind of got bored of that. But in that same space, as I was throwing, she started pottering, and she started noticing the gum on the tree, and she's like, "Look, Dad, the tree is making honey." And she played around, and she noticed that the bunny poop looked like plaits, and she's like, "How does a bunny poop plaits?" And she was just relaxed, and we had deep, meaningful, playful conversations. And what I noticed in the shift in my body was so significant that I felt healed. I felt completely relaxed at the end of that by just allowing myself to be and potter around and to play. And how healing play can be for the adult. How do we start to embody that sense of playfulness again?
Well, excuse me, I'm coughing a lot.
Okay.
So when we have a relaxed body, it's easier to play. Simultaneously, playfulness can help to relax our body, right? So when we're more relaxed, we're more creative. You know, what do we say? Some of our best ideas come in when we're in the shower, right? So when we're relaxed, we kind of shoot off the cuff a little bit more. We were spontaneous. We laugh more, right? So there is a relationship between play and relaxation. The more someone has trauma in their body, the more harder it is to relax. Because remember that the physiology of trauma is basically one of, I don't feel safe in the world. So if I don't feel safe in the world, I can't relax.
Right.
So why play is hard for adults is directly related to a physiology that doesn't feel safe and relaxed. And so it can be quite threatening to let our guard down and be imaginative. You know, it can be quite threatening to let our guard down and be spontaneous. You know, one of the things that happens in my play shops, as I call them, workshops, is there's this need to do it right. We're afraid to do it wrong. So that's the big thing that gets in the way of play is I'm afraid that of not doing it right. I'm afraid of doing it wrong, and therefore I'm afraid of getting judged. So, you know, for the mindset that is about right and wrong, it becomes harder to play. Again, that's a very rigid system.
Mhm.
So while children dance along fields of gray, adults feel more content to hang out in black and white. And so play is deeply healing for a nervous system that is afraid of gray. Because as a child, they got stung when hanging out in gray. So they had to move to the periphery, to the margins of black and white to be safe. So we have to learn to be creative. We have to learn to be imaginative. We have to learn that it's safe to be spontaneous and not plan everything. We have to learn to be in our bodies in such a way that allows for fluid movement. You know, I tell a lot of my clients to go do some form of free flow dance, some kind of ecstatic dance, like 5 rhythms, some place where they can be in their body and they can be in a safe environment where they can move their body and not be judged. A lot of parents, though, have this in their living rooms. They'll turn on some fun music and they'll dance with their kids, and the kids will be wild and free, and the parents are remembering how to dance by watching the kids, hopefully without alcohol. So, you know, so I guess what I'm saying is that I tell my participants, you know, I totally understand why play is not easy. It can be scary for all these reasons, because we learned that it's not safe to be imaginative, creative, spontaneous, wild, you know. It wasn't safe to be silly, you know. How many times did people hear growing up, don't be silly, or you need to be responsible? How many kids grew up where they had to actually raise some of their younger siblings? Maybe their mother passed away, or their father, or there were so many kids that they had to play the role of the parent, and so they didn't have the opportunity to be young and childlike. So it's not easy. It's not easy.
I want to open it up. We've got about 10 more minutes to our audience. I know lots of comments are coming through and people are really connecting to what you're saying. And we acknowledge that what you're talking about is helping us, but in a way, hold up a mirror to our own world and think about things that we may have disconnected from our bodies. And so I want to invite our audience to, if you do have a question, please just put it in the comments and we'll be able to pop it up. For Vince, I know one of the comments earlier said, are you able to heal your trauma as you get older, or is there a limit where it becomes too hard?
No, there's no limit. There's no limit. You can start at any time. The key is honestly finding a good practitioner. That's the key. There's your willingness, and then there's the competency of the practitioner. That's the key. If both come together, then you'll heal. But you don't need to, yeah, go ahead.
What does a good practitioner look like? Just if we are looking for someone who does this work, you know, some of us may have gone to traditional counselors. Is that what we're looking at, or how do we? What do you recommend for us to look for?
Ideally, if you're going to work with a counselor, they need to be a body-based counselor, in my opinion. The thing with trauma is, as you know from what I said earlier, is that a lot of trauma has its roots in pre-verbal times. So you may have trauma when you're 2. You may have trauma from when you were in utero. You may have trauma that comes from your birth trauma, or maybe you were put in an incubator right after without touch. And then there's trauma from the ancestral level. This is all pre-verbal. So if you're working with a talk therapist, how well are you going to access trauma that's pre-verbal using verbal means? So the body is the better way. As you said, the body keeps the score. We need to work directly with the nervous system and the body through what's called a somatic or body-based therapeutic approach. You don't need to work with a therapist. You can work with a good breath worker. Breath work is great, works directly with the body. I have opinions on what kinds of breath work are good. And I just want to put a shout out. You can work with me as well. And I do energetic healing remotely with clients as well. And you can find that on my website. It's called Distant Healing. So that's another way. It's to be truthful, it's the most effective way I can work with people and the most cost effective. And I'm a registered somatic therapist and a certified breath worker, and it's more powerful than either, and it's cheaper. So those are my
website. I'm going to put that up for you, just on the screen. What is your website, Vin?
It's Vince Gowmon. So Vince, and then just my name.com.
Okay, I'll put that on there.
And it's called, the work is called distant healing. Yeah.
That's it. Right. And people can connect with you over Zoom if they want to.
Yeah, they can connect with me through Zoom, and I can support their healing process for sure. And yeah, but yeah, ultimately we need help. You know, it's hard to do it on our own. There's certain things you can do, like slowing down. You know, going into nature, doing things that bring you joy, like painting, learning an instrument, cuddling your kids, spending time with good friends, having nourishing conversations. Those are all beautiful ways to support. But I do think we need something that's more like an intervention of some sort, like some kind of healing modality to get to the deeper layers. Yeah.
You talk about breathwork practitioner. I know both dancing. 2018, my New Year's resolution was that I wanted to dance more and get more uncomfortable, to embrace discomfort and to dance more. And it was by far the most healing year of my life. And
Mm.
we danced a lot. We danced outdoors in forests. We danced in the lounge. We danced with friends. Things that I never would have imagined that I would get into. I also embraced discomfort to start rewiring the story of who I had about myself. So I would start jumping in cold showers, not because of just the physiological benefit that it may be, but just simply because I hated the cold.
Mm.
And so to start embodying something that I've never thought I was able to do was super healing.
Yeah. Well, you're
And
speaking about discomfort. It's not comfortable to heal. So you're exploring these edges of discomfort.
100%, and becoming okay, and also seeing the incredible power outside of our trauma and our construct.
Yeah.
Breathwork is something that has also helped me tremendously, especially in embracing that deep sense of now and my body.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just talk to us a little bit about breathwork for people who may actually be quite new to the idea?
Well, when you're scared, what gets affected pretty quickly? It's your breath. When you're startled, if you're a child and you hear the door bang, you're gonna hold your breath. So again, there's nothing wrong with. It's generally okay if these things happen once in a while, and you hold your breath, or you shorten your breath, and you have a parent come and hold you, and then your breathing can relax. But when incidences become chronic, when there's repetitive incidences of fear, environmental failures at home, the breath starts to get affected. We shorten our breath. Babies know how to breathe nice full breaths. So what happens is when someone comes to me and we do breath work, breathing can be very hard for them, the kind of breathing that I do with them, which is basically deep, deep inhale, deep exhale, because their breath has been shortened. Now, why does the breath shorten? Well, it's a self-preservation. If I don't breathe as deeply, I don't feel as deeply.
Wow.
Okay, so the deeper I go, I bring breath in, the more I'm going to feel my body. So it's a way that I can manage feeling is by breathing more shallow. So what happens when I have a client working with me and they're on the mat and they're doing their breath work? Well, when they start to bring in a lot of breath, well, the feelings start to come because it was the short breaths that was pushing them down in the first place. So bring in a lot of breath, they start to emerge. So breathe to feel, right? Yeah.
Every emotional state has a breath pattern attached to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you want to change your emotional state, one of the ways that you can do that is to interrupt your breathing pattern in the moment.
That's right.
And
That's right.
as well. Just having a look and see if there's any other questions that's come in. Someone has asked, what are some strategies? And I think this is an interesting question that you may again go back to the root. But what are some strategies to work with children who are undergone a lot of trauma?
And I'm assuming that's within the daycare.
Yeah, within a early childhood setting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, make the connection more important than the learning agenda. Number one, that's the big. One of the things I say in my when I've worked with early childhood educators more than any other group, is that they need to create a value system within the daycare that makes it clear to parents that if a parent is going to come and bring their child there, that the parent knows that the daycares is far more interested in play and connection than academic achievement. So if you're going to bring your child here, just so you know, we don't really care how nicely designed his cookie cutter craft project is. What we care about is play, the messiness of play, and connection. If you're okay with your child coming here, great, but we're letting you know that right up front. So there's agreements so they know what to expect, so that they don't come back 6 months later and say, why isn't my Johnny achieving at this level? They already know what the culture is about. But all the educators need to be on the same page as well. So there's these agreements, these value-based agreements. So if that container is in place and the daycare teachers are on the same page, then you have a family unit of daycare providers that can really support and prioritize connection and play. So to me, it is spending as much time as possible in attachment-based language and attachment-based physical gestures, sort of touch, if you're allowed to touch. There's certain rules on how much you can hug kids, that changes depending on the geography, right?
Yeah.
I'll tell you a little story. I'll give you an example, okay? This friend of mine, she was in grade 8, and she was telling me how much she didn't like her kindergarten teacher. And I said, why? And you're hearing that noise. Is that allowed?
Yeah, it's quite loud, but we're managing. Is that the
fine with me, as long as I wasn't sure if it was going on. Oh, it went away. There we go. So she goes, when I was in kindergarten, I went up to my teacher one day and said, Mrs. Jones, I had a dream last night. And she was very excited to tell Mrs. Jones about her dream. And I said, well, what did Mrs. Jones tell you? And she said, that's nice, dear. Why don't you go draw a picture about it? And I said, what would you have liked her to have said instead? And she said, well, all she had to say was tell me about it. Now, here's the thing. When a teacher says, that's nice, dear, why don't you draw a picture about it? What she's doing is she's turning a child's process into a product. She's going from process to product. Now that's the problem with kids, going back to the industrial model, is we're turning them into products. Here's the other thing to understand, is when the teacher says, that's nice, dear, go draw a picture about it, the emphasis is on the future. But if the teacher says, wow, tell me about your dream, the emphasis is on the now. So product future, process now. So if you want to help a child's nervous system regulate, focus on process now. If you focus on product future, enough of this makes a child feel disregarded and anxious. Remember, it's the relationship that needs to be emphasized. It's the relationship failure that caused dysregulation in the first place. So now you have to be that secure base that practices listening, empathy, and curiosity. Those are the three keys: listening, empathy, curiosity. Wow, tell me more about it is curiosity. Mm-hmm. Wow, I can hear how hard that is for you is empathy. So, but preceding that, the educator, the daycare worker needs to be regulated. That's the self-care, that's the self-healing. Because if you're not regulated, how will you co-regulate? So it's your healing and self-care, it's the listening, empathy, and curiosity, and it's the present time process and making that far more important than future time product.
That's so good. And I'm sure we can go a lot deeper. And Vince, I do feel a deep connection between what you're saying and what our beautiful whānau and teachers and sector really wants to hear more of. So I am sure this is not going to be the last time that we're going to speak. In fact, I know that we already spoke about possibly if we do have a conference next week that you can be a part of that in some way or capacity, which would be absolutely wonderful. So we're gonna end our broadcast there. So much to reflect on and to think of. I really want to just express my gratitude for the work that you're doing, the heart that you have for healing, and encourage our friends and our listeners to go and connect with you. I know that you can track who's coming from New Zealand, so it'd be great to flood your website.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I have to say that that the articles and the language that you use is healing in itself. So much good reading.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's been so much fun and connecting with you, Maria, and a real pleasure to put a little footprint in New Zealand remotely. And I have a lot of love for New Zealand. Met lots of beautiful Kiwis, and of course was raised by them. So I have a special place in my heart. I'm also a big Lord of the Rings fan, so there's that as well.
It feels connected.
And a
Absolutely.
rugby fan, I gotta say it. I love the All Blacks. So there you go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vince.
Yeah.
My friends, if you guys want a professional development certificate for the session, or we've been uploading all these sessions into our Talent LMS, our online thing. So just go have a look there. We haven't answered your question. You've asked one. We are getting to it. We've been a little bit overwhelmed, but please keep an eye out on our Facebook page, Conscious Collective Education, for an announcement about what's happening next week. Much love, everybody. Stay safe and slow down, listen, feel, and let's start our healing journey together. Ka kite anō.
Thank you.